It's the most famous military disaster in American history, Pearl Harbor. But the real story isn't the 8 battleships sunk. Just a few miles from the Inferno, sitting in plain sight, was 45 million barrels of fuel, the absolute logistical heart of the Pacific Fleet. The Japanese attack was tactically flawless, yet their single greatest mistake was letting that oil survive. Because they flew right past it, they guaranteed their own defeat 6 months later, December 7th, 1941. At 7:55 a.m., the first wave of Japanese bombers screamed over the green Ko'olau Mountains of Oahu. In minutes, the calm, shimmering waters of Pearl Harbor became a churning, black inferno, and Battleship Row transformed from a symbol of American naval power into a ruin of twisted steel and boiling oil. The attack arrived with terrifying speed and surgical precision. Sunday morning stillness was instantly shattered by the roar of 227 aircraft and the deafening crack of anti-aircraft guns. For the men still rubbing sleep from their eyes, the sight of the rising sun on the wings of the incoming planes was a paralyzing, unbelievable horror. This was not a drill. This was not practice. This was war, delivered with a shock so profound that it momentarily froze the reaction of the American forces. The Japanese attack commander signaled that the enemy was completely unprepared, and the air crews settled in for the kill. The first targets were the airfields, pulverized in a massive opening blow designed to keep American planes on the ground. Then came the main event, Battleship Row. The 8 towering ships, the pride of the Pacific Fleet, were moored closely together along Ford Island. They were fat, tempting targets, sitting ducks for the elite Japanese torpedo bombers. The initial torpedo runs were devastating. The torpedoes, specially modified with wooden fins to run in the shallow harbor, hit below the waterline with sickening accuracy. The USS Oklahoma took 9 torpedo hits in succession and quickly rolled over, trapping hundreds of men inside its iron hull. The most catastrophic loss was the USS Arizona. Struck by several armor-piercing bombs, one bomb, a converted 16-inch shell, pierced the deck near the forward ammunition magazine. The resulting explosion was massive, a blinding pillar of fire that shot nearly a mile into the sky. The ship's 1,500 tons of powder ignited instantly, and the blast was so violent it lifted the entire foresection of the battleship out of the water before it collapsed and sank, taking over 1,000 men with it. The air was thick with the smell of burning fuel, cordite, and human terror. In less than 20 minutes, the naval cornerstone of the United States in the Pacific had been reduced to smoking wreckage. The destruction was nearly absolute. In 2 waves, Japan had damaged or destroyed every single battleship present, wrecked 188 aircraft, and killed 2,403 Americans. From a purely tactical standpoint, it was the perfect execution of a daring plan. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's goal, ambitious and clear, was to deliver a knockout blow that would cripple the United States Pacific Fleet for at least 6 to 12 months. This window of time, this necessary pause, was crucial. It was the calculated time Japan needed to seize the oil and resources of the Dutch East Indies and establish an impenetrable defensive perimeter across Southeast Asia. The battleships were the face of American power, and their destruction was psychologically crushing. It was the spectacular, visible evidence of success that the Japanese commanders craved and that the press at home would celebrate. However, as the last Japanese planes turned back toward their carriers, a number of American officers on the island began to notice an anomaly amid the smoke and wreckage. A few miles inland, completely untouched, were the massive, dull-colored storage tanks of the main fuel depot. Even more confounding, the crucial repair facilities, the dry docks and machine shops were still standing. The Japanese had focused their attack almost entirely on the obsolete battleships and the easy targets of the anchored aircraft, driven by a doctrinal belief that the battleship remained the decisive weapon of naval warfare. They had achieved tactical brilliance, but they had demonstrated a profound strategic blindness. The pilots had been given their targets, the obvious, the impressive, the visible. They had executed the plan flawlessly. But in doing so, they completely ignored the true, logistical heart of the American war machine. The ships could be replaced. Battleships were already on their way to becoming obsolete against the power of the aircraft carrier. But the facilities needed to support the fleet were another matter entirely. The fuel depot held enough oil to sustain the entire Pacific Fleet for an estimated 1.5 years of continuous operation. If those 45 million barrels had gone up in smoke, if the dry docks capable of repairing ships had been destroyed, the American response to the attack would have been set back not by months, but by years. The entire Pacific Fleet would have been forced to steam over 2,000 miles back to the American west coast for refueling and repair, leaving Japan unchallenged to consolidate its vast new empire. As the smoke began to clear over the wreckage of the Arizona and the salvage operations commenced, the critical oversight became terrifyingly clear to the Americans and, momentarily, was the subject of desperate internal debate aboard the Japanese flagship. The carnage had been vast, the tactical success absolute, but the most important targets, the targets that truly governed the pace of the Pacific War, remained standing, quietly holding the future. The Japanese had sunk the symbols of American power, but they had left the means of its revenge completely intact, setting the stage for a dramatic strategic confrontation that would arrive much sooner than they expected. To truly grasp the magnitude of what the Japanese missed, one must first understand the logic behind what they chose to hit and why. The architect of the Pearl Harbor strike was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a brilliant, controversial, and deeply conflicted genius. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard and served in Washington. He knew the staggering industrial might of the United States better than any other Japanese admiral. He had spent years arguing against war with America, famously stating that if forced to fight, he would run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that I have utterly no confidence. The Pearl Harbor plan was born not of overconfidence, but of desperation, a huge gamble to buy the time he knew Japan desperately needed. Yamamoto's strategy was simple: neutralize the United States Pacific Fleet immediately so Japan could move unmolested into the resource-rich South. The naval planners, trained in the dogma of the 19th and early 20th centuries, immediately fixated on the battleships. These massive, heavily armored vessels were, in their minds, the ultimate measure of naval power. The doctrine dictated that the war would be decided by a single, colossal, decisive battle between the main battleship fleets, a replay of the Russo-Japanese War's Battle of Tsushima, but on a grander scale. Thus, the Japanese target priority list placed Battleship Row at the absolute top. The carriers, the USS Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were a worry, but they were considered secondary vessels, glorified transports for the reconnaissance aircraft that would spot the battleships. When Commander Fuchida radioed back to the fleet that the American carriers were ATSEA, the news was greeted with disappointment, but not panic. The main objective, the sinking of the battle fleet, was still achievable. The two attack waves focused relentlessly on this primary goal. The success metrics for the mission were based on traditional naval standards, the count of dreadnoughts sunk or disabled. When the reports came back to the fleet, the results seemed impossibly good. 8 battleships sunk or severely damaged, 4 of them total losses. This outcome represented a magnificent tactical success. The American battle fleet was, for all intents and purposes, wiped out, guaranteeing the 6-month grace period that Yamamoto had gambled on. But the obsession with the battleships exposed a deep, crippling flaw in the Japanese Navy's thinking. They were fighting a war of the past. The strategic genius of Yamamoto had conceived of a carrier strike, but his subordinates, especially Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who commanded the strike force, remained battleship admirals at heart. They had used the modern weapon, the carrier, to destroy the old enemy, the battleship, but they hadn't internalized the change in strategic reality. The battleships were irrelevant. The war in the Pacific would be won and lost by aircraft carriers and the logistical ability to keep them running. This outdated doctrine meant that the true, modern targets, the infrastructure that fueled and maintained the new carrier fleet, were completely disregarded. Why sink the repair yards? Battleships take years to build and replace. Why hit the oil tanks? Fuel could surely be acquired elsewhere. This was the logic of a localized, short war, not the long, resource-intensive industrial conflict that Yamamoto knew he was initiating against a giant. The choice of targets was a fatal choice of naval tradition over foresight. They achieved the win, but they walked right past the target that mattered more than every battleship combined. This target was about to be revealed to the shocked Americans. While the Arizona burned and rescue crews pulled oil-soaked sailors from the harbor, a few American officers stood on the hillsides overlooking the carnage, staring at something that should have been burning too. 20 massive fuel storage tanks, each a dull, olive-green cylinder, sat completely untouched just a few miles from the devastation. This was the Red Hill Fuel Depot. They held 45 million barrels of oil, a staggering volume, and their vulnerability was visually undeniable. They were large, above ground, and offered no pretense of camouflage. They were, quite literally, a sitting target. The fuel inside those tanks was the entire future of the Pacific War. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, who would take command of the Pacific Fleet soon after the attack, later stated with grim precision, "If the Japanese had destroyed the fuel, it would have set us back 2 years." Nimitz understood that losing the battleships was a blow to pride and manpower, but losing the fuel would have been a death blow to American strategy. The strategic reality was simple and brutal. Naval power is defined by logistics. Without fuel, ships cannot move. Without the vast stores at Red Hill, the surviving American ships, including the invaluable, albeit still at sea, aircraft carriers would have had to steam 2,500 miles back to ports like San Diego, Long Beach, and San Francisco simply to refill their bunkers. That journey would have taken days, and the turnaround for refueling and rearming would have taken weeks. For over a month, perhaps 2, the American presence in the Central Pacific would have been non-existent. This scenario would have guaranteed the Japanese the absolute control over the Pacific Ocean they desperately sought. It would have guaranteed them the 6 to 12 months they needed to solidify their positions in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. The war would have been fundamentally different, dragging out into a grueling multi-year campaign just to dislodge the enemy from their fortified perimeter. Compounding this oversight, the Japanese had also ignored the vital repair facilities at Pearl. The massive No. 2 dry dock, the extensive machine shops, the submarine base, all remained intact. These facilities meant that ships damaged at Pearl Harbor could be patched up and returned to action within weeks, rather than having to make the perilous, time-consuming cross-ocean journey for repair. The very logic of the Japanese attack demanded the destruction of this infrastructure. Yamamoto's plan required a decisive, lasting blow to prevent a quick American counterattack. The destruction of the ships achieved the first, but the survival of the logistics base fatally undermined the second. Japan needed a strategic victory, a win that disabled America's ability to wage war in the Pacific. By focusing solely on the visual, tactical prize of the battleships, the Japanese leadership demonstrated a blindness that saved the American war effort before it even began. It set up the devastating question that must have haunted Nagumo. Why didn't they come back for the kill? We value your historical insights. Please take a moment to comment below on what you think was the biggest strategic blunder of the Pearl Harbor attack. On the bridge of the flagship carrier Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo faced the most important decision of his life. It was just past 10 o'clock in the morning. His pilots, flushed with tactical success, were begging for a third strike. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, landing back aboard and reporting the devastation, passionately argued for a follow-up wave. The reconnaissance had confirmed the existence of the massive, visible fuel tanks and the intact dry docks. Destroying the infrastructure, Fuchida argued, would turn a brilliant tactical victory into a decisive strategic triumph. But Nagumo was a man of the old school, a cautious, traditional, and deeply conventional battleship admiral who had been thrust into command of the most revolutionary naval force in the world. He was unnerved by the success of the first 2 waves and haunted by the knowledge that the American carriers, the Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were still lurking somewhere nearby. His strategic mission was to deliver the knockout blow and then return his precious carrier fleet intact. Risking them for oil tanks seemed reckless. The debate aboard the Akagi was sharp. Aggressive pilots like Fuchida, who saw the chance to end the Pacific campaign right then, versus the conservative admiral who prioritized the safety of his fleet. Nagumo worried that a third strike would take hours to organize, launch, and recover. The American defenses, though initially shocked, were now fully alert and fighting back. Any delay increased the risk that one of the undetected American carriers would find and attack his undefended task force while the planes were off hitting shore targets. The decision to run, to save his 6 carriers, was, paradoxically, the moment he sealed the fate of all 4 of them. Nagumo's logic was rooted in self-preservation and doctrinal rigidity. He reasoned, the primary objective, the destruction of the battleships, has been achieved. The American fleet is crippled. To linger is to invite unnecessary risk. His traditionalist thinking could not comprehend that the obvious, spectacular victory was strategically meaningless compared to the less visible, logistical targets. At 10:30 a.m., Nagumo issued the fateful order, withdraw. We have achieved our objective, he concluded. The Japanese fleet turned north and began its high-speed retreat, leaving the 45 million barrels of fuel standing, the dry docks ready for use, and the submarine base fully operational. This single conservative decision by a capable but conventional admiral proved to be the greatest strategic error of the entire Pacific War. Yamamoto, waiting for news back in Japan, had secretly hoped and even planned for a third strike, knowing that only the destruction of the facilities would guarantee the necessary time. When he received the report of the withdrawal, his private reaction was one of profound disappointment, a tragic recognition that the first, perfect 6 hours of the war had already set the stage for Japan's ultimate defeat. Nagumo had saved his 6 carriers, but in doing so, he had doomed them all. If you're finding this deep dive into the strategic failures of Pearl Harbor intriguing, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue to produce content that challenges common historical narratives. The consequence of Nagumo's caution was delivered with devastating speed just 6 months later at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. The Japanese believed they were sailing against a crippled American force, still reeling and recovering on the west coast. Instead, they met a patched-together American fleet powered by the very fuel Nagumo chose not to destroy. The 3 American carriers that had been at sea on December 7th, the Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, were the key to victory. The Yorktown had been severely damaged just weeks earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Yet, thanks to the intact Pearl Harbor dry docks and machine shops left standing by Nagumo, the ship's engineering crews accomplished what was deemed impossible. They repaired the carrier in 72 hours, not the 90 days originally estimated. Fueled entirely by the massive reserves at the Red Hill tanks, the American carriers steamed out to meet the enemy. On June 4, 1942, the tables turned completely. In a series of crushing air attacks, the 3 American carriers sank 4 of Japan's frontline carriers in a single, catastrophic day. The destruction was the strategic reversal of the war. The very things the Japanese failed to sink at Pearl Harbor, the carriers, the fuel, the dry docks, were the precise elements that allowed the United States to absorb the initial blow and strike back with lethal speed. Japan never recovered from the loss of its 4 irreplaceable carriers and its elite air crews. The 6 to 12 months of freedom Yamamoto had gambled on were instantly reduced to 6 weeks, and the strategic initiative was forever lost. Admiral Nimitz's later assessment remained the definitive truth. The survival of the logistics base at Pearl Harbor, particularly the fuel tanks, meant that the American counter-offensive began not in late 1943, but in early 1942. The battleships that Japan sank at Pearl Harbor, eventually raised from the mud and put back into service, were slow and obsolete, mostly used for shore bombardment. The carrier had been confirmed as the war winner. The ultimate irony was the personal cost. Yamamoto, the genius who devised the attack but saw its fatal flaw, continued to wage his losing war until he was intercepted and shot down in 1943. He died fighting a strategic conflict he knew had been lost on the morning of December 7th, not because of the ships that sank, but because of the 20 massive tanks of oil that stood untouched, holding the power of the inevitable American counterstrike. Today, the Red Hill Fuel Depot, a marvel of Cold War engineering that was eventually moved underground, is a subject of environmental concern, but its historical legacy is immutable. Wars are not lost by what your enemy destroys, but by what they leave you to fight with. The targets the Japanese didn't hit at Pearl Harbor were the reason they lost the war. Thank you for reading this piece of historical analysis. If you'd like to follow the rest of this story, be sure to subscribe for future chapters, comment with your thoughts on this pivotal moment in history, and share this with anyone interested in World War II strategy.